Okay, thank you everybody for coming. Really appreciate it. My name is Carl Szabo. I'm Vice President and General Counsel at NetChoice. We're an e-commerce trade association. Yeah, we can all push down the mics since they don't work, but we will project as best we can. So the discussion today is Section 230. Our internet depends on it. But what is Section 230? Many of us in the industry call it the most important internet law you've never heard of. Well, since we say that, we should probably tell you what it is. So think about a dog walker. Dog walker goes to Starbucks, they're looking for business. They put up on the bulletin board at Starbucks their name, their phone number. Somebody takes a coupon off, calls the person up. They don't show up. They have to miss a day of work because the dog walker didn't arrive. Should Starbucks be held liable? Well, no, of course not. They're just a bulletin board system. Well, that's the offline kind of corollary to what Section 230 is. It creates a bulletin board system where users can post content, but we allow platforms, Starbucks in one case, some of the people sitting at the table here is another, to kind of just host that content without assuming the liability. But this hasn't always been the case. Back in the 90s, there was a company called Prodigy. They're still kind of around. It was an internet service, and they had a bulletin board service, just like Starbucks, and somebody was posting about the Wolf of Wall Street group. Well, the Wolf of Wall Street people didn't really like what was said about them, so they actually went and sued Prodigy, rather than suing the actual poster, and back in 1995, Prodigy was designed to be family-friendly. They moderated for content. They took down offensive stuff, and the court looked at it and said, well, Prodigy, since you're moderating and trying to be family-friendly, you're not quite like a bulletin board anymore. Now you're more like an editor at a newspaper. And because you're trying to be family-friendly, you are going to be liable for the defaming comments about the Wolf of Wall Street firm. So fast forward 1 year, Representative Chris Cox, at the time Representative Rod Wyden, saw this, and they drafted a bipartisan approach because they were concerned that this discouraged not only good actions to take down bad content, but it seemed to move away from the idea of having a decent and family-friendly internet that we all like today. Section 230 was not created to help out social media platforms, since back in 1996 they didn't yet exist. But it was created to ensure that the internet would be family-friendly and work appropriate. At the end of the day, the easiest way to think of Section 230 is that it allows platforms to host content and it holds the people responsible, the ones who post it, responsible for what they say. Just think about the idea of holding the Washington Post liable for the comment section below your favorite article. Section 230 enshrines kind of the online version of what we call the Good Samaritan Law. So the Good Samaritan Law, back in the day, was you'd walk down the street, you see somebody lying on the ground, you provide CPR, maybe you break a rib while doing it, but you're trying to do the right thing. So we decided as a society for policy, we want to encourage people to try and do the right thing. So Section 230, the Communications Decency Act, includes what's called the Good Samaritan provision, which allows websites, posts, platforms, services to take down content they find objectionable without assuming liability for all content. Once again, we want to encourage people to do the right thing. So that brings us to today. And this is why we called it Section 230. Our internet depends on it, because Section 230 is the foundation on which hundreds of online platforms are built. Craigslist, Yelp, Eventbrite, GoFundMe, Vimeo, Reddit, Facebook, Google, Twitter, to just name a few. And of course, when the discussion of anything tech-related comes up, seemingly here or in other avenues, the conversation centralizes on only a couple of key players. We end up focusing on, well, Google, Facebook, and Twitter, right? But that's why we wanted to bring this amazing panel here today, some of whom flew across the country to talk to you, because we want to discuss what Section 230 really is, who it impacts, and help you understand that it's a much bigger, broader base than just the largest players that are here today. It's these sites and their users that we must remember as we have any conversation on Section 230. And as your bosses and colleagues are talking about Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, or online bias, or takedown of speech, or limitations on tech, we want you to think about this broader conversation that really needs to be considered, because it's not just impacting 3 companies, it's impacting thousands of businesses across the country. So with that, I want to introduce our panel. I hate opening statements, so we are not going to have them. Instead, we're just going to jump into the questions, and then we'll definitely leave some time for your questions, because we definitely want to be responsive to what you have to you want to know. So we have Alex Fierst, who is head of legal at Medium. We have, to his right, Colin Sullivan, head of legal at Patreon. Rachel Walbers, who is policy director at Engine Advocacy, and Sherwin C., who is senior public policy manager at the Wikimedia Foundation. So, jumping right in, Colin, I was talking to my mom about Patreon, and she'd actually never heard of Patreon. And I explained to her, it's something about artists. So what is Patreon? Let's start there so we understand what you do, and then we can jump into what 230 is. Nope, I don't know.
I'll just keep projecting.
Yeah.
I think Patreon's one of those companies where once you've heard of it, you probably see it all over the place, but it's also very easy to overlook. We're a membership platform that makes it easy for artists and creators to get paid by their fans. So some examples of that would be podcasters or bloggers or people with a YouTube channel. Basically, anybody who wants to put some sort of content out online and monetize that are able to make a page on Patreon and then get subscription payments from their fans.
And okay, so I create the page on Patreon. What does that have to do with Section 230? Why did you fly from San Francisco to come here and talk to us? Why do you care?
Well, as I'm sure you can imagine, we have 100,000 creators, which means we have creators all over the world, in every state, every district in the United States. And that's a remarkable variety of speech. We have people saying pretty much anything you can think of. And if we were liable for all of that speech, then the amount of liability would be insurmountable. I mean, we wouldn't exist as a company. So we need to have that protection to be able to, first of all, not be liable for that speech. And then, because we do have huge amounts of content that we do need to remove from fraud or other bad actor reasons, being able to have that Good Samaritan clause to allow us to remove that content safely.
And so you said you have, hundreds of thousands of creators?
Over 100,000, yeah.
And your legal team is how big?
So the legal team is 3 attorneys.
Okay, fantastic. Certainly a small company, I would say at least. Rachel, you're over at Engine Advocacy. You are kind of like the Lorax for small businesses. I speak for the small businesses. Wouldn't the smaller guys really be in the best position to moderate content and not really need to worry about Section 230 because they don't have that much content really to deal with?
So Engine Advocacy, we're a nonprofit think tank. Half of us are here in DC and half in San Francisco. And we really work with startups across the country. We work with startups in all 50 states. And our premise, in particular here in DC, is that there are startups in all 50 states, that every community has entrepreneurs, and we want to make sure that we're creating predictable regulatory landscape for new companies who are entering the marketplace. And since the creation of the internet, the type of company who can start a business, anybody can start a website, host content, solicit users to interact, and find creative ways to make a business. And Section 230 protects a much broader range of companies than just social media platforms. If you think about dating apps, that's a tremendous amount of user-generated content. Airbnb, Yelp, Pinterest, Uber and Lyft even have user-generated content on their Venmo. How many of you have sent your friends beer money and had to put a little beer like emoji in there. So the point is that there are all these new companies. They all use user-generated content, whether that's to provide trust and safety or to provide users new means to connect with each other and their friends and create a business. And so the way that Section 230 is structured really allows platforms to think creatively about how to start a platform, start a business, and then they can curate the content in ways that might appeal to the audience that they're trying to attract. So, Facebook has traditionally been a more family-friendly audience than maybe Reddit, right? Reddit has, you go into like deep into crazy subreddits, and that's okay because that's the kind of audience that Reddit can attract. It's not a one-size-fits-all, and new companies can come up all the time. And so I think small companies actually can generate a tremendous amount of user-generated content. And so to Carl's question, companies like Patreon and Medium, you can launch a website and have hundreds of millions of active users and a lot of content happening, and you might not be able to track and monitor all of that content. It's actually much easier for big companies. You can hire big teams of content moderators, whether they're in the United States or somewhere else around the world, that can moderate content, whereas small platforms can kind of pick and choose what flavor of content moderation fits the audience that they're trying to attract.
Yeah, and I mean, just to kind of push on that point a little. So, there's a lot of techlash going on. I think there were a bunch of tweets last night alone about this issue. People are angry at some of the big tech players, but actually kind of trying to attack them this way might actually hurt competition that they face today. Sounds like.
Yeah, I think, the more regulation and requirements that you're placing earlier on are going to create bigger burdens for people to be able to start their companies. The internet has really created this whole huge wave of startups because it's so much less expensive to start a company than it ever was before. You can essentially, if you have an internet connection, you can launch a business. And so the businesses, the statistic that we have seen from the Kauffman Foundation's research is the average startup starts with $75,000. Not a lot of money. And it's definitely not enough money to survive even one legal bill, whether that is on something besides content moderation, but you start really small, and if you're going to have to hire a big team of lawyers right at the beginning, it will hurt competition and the ability to have new entrants into marketplaces.
Well, speaking of lawyers, we're turning to Sherwin because he's an attorney. So you're with Wikimedia Foundation, I should say, and I think most everyone in this room has probably visited Wikimedia at least once in their lives, if not multiple times today. But your group started very, very small with just an idea of open source. I mean, where would you be without Section 230?
It'd be a really, really tough road. I work at the Wikimedia Foundation, which is the nonprofit that supports Wikipedia amongst a whole bunch of other projects. There's probably about 250 to 300 different Wikipedias, one for each language that it operates in. And there's other projects as well, such as Wikimedia Commons, where people upload public domain works or works that are dedicated to sharing. And the thing about our relationship to all of those projects is we don't run them. Those things were built by users. And the users in the community that came together to contribute to an online encyclopedia that anybody can access for free, those people got together before the foundation existed. So they sort of assembled, the foundation grew out of that, and we helped provide the servers that run the back end, some of the software that people can use to edit that stuff. But everything that you read on Wikipedia was written by some user, not anybody at the foundation. So all of the things that get put on there and all of the things that people argue about with each other on Wikipedia and about in other forums as well, those disputes are between different users, and we're not the ones adjudicating them. So when somebody says, oh, this person, somebody, Wikipedia wrote this article and it says I'm a terrible person, it's like, well, it's on Wikipedia. Somebody put that up there. And if there's an argument about that, that's for people to work out there through different channels. And if somebody wants to sue us, if somebody were to sue us for everything negative that might be written about them on Wikipedia, that would be a huge problem. People sometimes will do this because there's honest disputes about how to characterize something. Sometimes people do that because people will vandalize stuff, right? Somebody will go on the Pittsburgh Penguins page and say that they are the worst team ever to take the ice in North America. And okay, maybe that's a bad fallacy.
The truth is a defense. So,
but it's also, people will randomly vandalize things, and they will say things that could be actionable. And the fact that 230 exists means that the platform can self-correct and work to correct those things without like all of these different sources of liability piling in all at the same time.
yeah, you and I were talking earlier. I actually got into a bit of a Wikimedia battle with somebody over a piece of post, and I made a change, they made a change, and I made a change, and eventually we did reach consensus where either we both agreed it was good enough or we both gave up equally. But it seemed to be kind of the right outcome. But to your point, Wikipedia was not involved in that interaction at all. It's just myself and one other user talking about content.
Right.
And we were able to achieve that nice interlude. Now, speaking of platforms that allow others to host content, I return to Alex here. So I think some people in the room are familiar with Medium. I hear FCC Chairman Pai's favorite platform of choice these days. I heard it's being used for advocacy and information. Can you talk about how you're seeing people in policy use Medium and how they kind of interact with that on a day-to-day basis?
Sure. Yeah, and so to give 1 or 2 minutes on Medium, we are a tech company, and we're working on something very ancient, which is writing and reading and thinking and educating. And we're trying to optimize for quality. We want people to be able to write things that are high quality, and we want them to do it in an environment where people respond to them substantively. So that's our mission statement. We're doing, our founder, last time he founded a company, it was Twitter. We're doing a different thing this time. So part of the ambition for Medium is to be a neutral ground where people can come write whatever they want. So within the bounds of writing something that's long form and that's thoughtful and substantive. So if you want to write an essay on why you're leaving your job to go hiking for a year, or why you're starting a company, or why you're closing your company, or some think piece you have on some policy, or if somebody at a tabloid is extorting you. These are all perfectly good things that you might post about on Medium. And so while we want to have rules around civility and credibility and responding to people in substance, we want to allow people to write what they want. So part of the way that CDA 230 fits into my work, just to put you in my shoes for a second, is that somebody writes something on Medium and says, yeah, I got this email, it's extorting me or whatever, and then you say, well, and then somebody else says, well, if you don't take that down, I'm going to sue you, and then you're legal.
Sue you, Medium.
Yeah, sue us,
Okay.
Medium, because it's up on Medium. And I should say about 10 to 12,000 posts go up a day nowadays. So we're a small company. We have about 110 employees. We have about 90 million people a month who read on Medium. So we have about 900,000 people each to look after. And so when somebody, so if something controversial, as Sherwood echoes sort of Sherman's point, if something controversial goes up, if we immediately get someone saying, okay, well, we're going to sue you. Even with CDA 230, which is extremely helpful and important, it'll cost tens of thousands of dollars to defend a lawsuit like that. So they say, okay, take it down and we're going to sue you. With CDA 230, you can say, look, like you should, like it sounds like a bad thing there. We don't know if it's true or not, because how could we know? The responsible person is the person who wrote it. that's the right person to go after, just as you would in real world, where the personal responsibility falls on the person who wrote the thing and posted the thing. We're going to try to get out of the way. And P.S., if we took it down and said, we agree with you, this probably should come down, leaving aside the fact that some percentage of people will find this to be alarming and have free speech issues and be problematic for all sorts of reasons, the person who's had their post taken down will then say, I will sue you because of these violations. And so CDA 230, part of when Senators Wyden and Cox wrote this was like, we are stuck, when you start an intermediary, they call you an intermediary because you're stuck in the middle. And so if you're doing your job, everybody will wind up mad at you pretty quickly. And so part of the beauty of CDA 230 is that it allows you to extricate yourself from the very human disputes that happen on your platform when people post things. So for me, it's an essential part of everyday life and allowing sort of people to own their own words that they post in a way that allows us to keep providing a platform for them to post them.
And, Alex, you and I talked earlier. It sounds like you wake up in the morning on Monday, you take some action, it's on posts. How does, you get notices that these are really despicable things, and you look at them and you're like, maybe they are, maybe they aren't. CDA 230 really helps you take action immediately?
Yeah, so I guess there's two things there. One thing is that I think CDA 230 provides a baseline where you're able to say, okay, if necessary, we are the place where other people host their stuff. On top of that, I think, as you all know from reading whatever's online this week, that like every company does a ton of stuff on top of that. There's not a world that exists where platforms do nothing. With the exception of some fringy folks like Gab and other platforms, everybody does a ton. As you've all probably read, there's tens of thousands of folks whose job is to look at stuff. So CDA 230 is this baseline that says, if you're trying to do the right thing, we're not going to tell you which thing to do. And on top of that sort of base structure, every platform tries to experiment and figure out how to moderate and how to get stuff done the right way. And so for me, that freedom to operate is what the law provides. So on a pretty regular basis, I won't say daily, but maybe it feels that way, I will get letters from folks that just say, like, this has to come down, that has to come down, this is not true. And so it frees us up to say, we're going to moderate this based on our rules. How credible is this? Does this look like it's coming from some state actor? Does this look like it's involved in some conspiracy theory? Does this look like it's abusing, it's harassing some person or posting their home address? We can look at all of these forms of data and figure out what we want in our platform with the knowledge that CDA 230 allows us to experiment that way. If you had a bunch of restrictions that said, here are the things that you must do to qualify for this protection, it sort of becomes unworkable because then you don't know what you're allowed to do on top of it. And what we've seen oddly is that like with this baseline protection of extricating platforms from the question of who posted it, every platform does their own flavor of thing based on the needs of the product. So the folks at Patreon and us, everybody evolves their own practices based on the style of community that they want to have. And then this is sort of the freedom that we have for them.
And Colin, Patreon, you have lots of artists, lots of creators. They may create content. I mean, that's what artists do. They provocateurs, if you will. I mean, they provoke.
Yeah.
How do you deal with those types of situations where it might go too far, and how does Section 230 really help you address those situations?
Well, I think speaking to Alex's comment about the complaints that we receive hundreds to, in some weeks, thousands of complaints per week for content that's posted or funded through Patreon. And the vast majority of those we don't take action on because they don't violate our own guidelines. And so Section 230 allows us to have that bulwark and say, it's great that you don't like that, and maybe in another world, we would have legal liability for that, you might sue us for that, but in this world, we don't have to deal with that. And we just say, thank you for your complaint, but that content, that creator is staying up. And occasionally it escalates beyond that. Sometimes we'll get written demand letters from attorneys representing people who are claiming defamation or some other offense. And again, most of those will just send a response saying, thank you for your complaint, that's staying up. If you want to take this further, we'll see you in court. And that's actually gone to court one time, and fortunately that was ruled in our favor. But again, because of Section 230, it's very easy to confidently go to court and say, we're not taking action here. We're willing to spend the tens of thousands of dollars as a And frankly, if we didn't have Section 230, we probably wouldn't have even gotten that far. It just would have come down.
And why the delta? I mean, so regardless, even with Section 230 today, you're still going to pay legal fees. This is not a gravy train free ride type situation.
So yeah, for the complaint that went to a lawsuit, I think we ended up spending somewhere around $50,000 or $60,000 to defend that, and that was because we took the stance that the creator in question had not violated the policies, and we, as a result, did not want to remove him from our platform. And that was a very explicit demand from the other party, was that they remove this creator from the platform, or that we remove the creator from the platform. So in that case, we were willing to spend that amount, but if there was potential liability for that, then at the very least, we would have had to go to trial, and that would be in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, and it wouldn't have been just decided on a summary judgment. And the worst case scenario is we find liable for the damages that they were potentially causing. In this case, that creator was actually also being sued in conjunction with us, but at least for our portion of it, we were able to get out of it.
Alex, I
wanted to emphasize, I agree with Colin on all this stuff. It's for each case that becomes a lawsuit, for each thing that actually flowers into a lawsuit, where you have to sort of show your work and go through the exercise of spending, like Colin said, maybe $50,000 in legal fees to get something dismissed at the motion to dismiss phase, which for Mendino is a bargain. The deterrence is what allows you to operate at all, because when somebody says this, I'm going to sue you for defamation or for some other related tort, if you can credibly say you will not win, and then when most folks will go look at the law and look at what's going on, and they'll say, okay, you're right. So for each one of these sort of flare-ups that Colin's talking about, I would say there's probably hundreds or thousands of instances where somebody sends you a letter, and then you have a spirited exchange of views over CDA 230. And then it winds up allowing those, essentially to go away. What's interesting, as he says, if in a world where there was a much more complex law in which you had to show up and say oh, we are engaging in good content moderation practices, and you can tell this because here's an expert witness who says we are moderating content well, and here's a bunch of discovery on what our content moderators do, and here's some expert reports on our rules and guidelines. That changes those suits from $50,000 affairs to $800,000 affairs. And for a company like Medium, one or two of those a year is sort of enough to put you out of business.
And I think just to reiterate what Alex is saying, the number of people who come forward and take those things further, we get a lot of complaints. I think a lot less than some people, but people will complain about things that are on Wikipedia. And a lot of the times, when you look at those complaints, there's nothing actionable there. It's like, I don't like this thing. And if they're able to if they know that doesn't escalate into a lawsuit with a plausible cause of action, and then we don't have this bolster of Section 230 with it, they take that further, and more of those suits come in, and it just becomes even more of a burden. It's really not just a question of what happens in each individual case. It's sort of the cumulative effect of what that does to the incentive of somebody who wants to, even if they don't want the money, a lot of times they want to change what's online that's been written about them or their client or somebody like that. And if they can go and find somebody who's written something and find a platform that has just a couple of lawyers and not a lot of time, they figure if we can make a big enough nuisance out of ourselves, they'll just fold without wanting to spend on full litigation.
And look, a lot of my law students would love the opportunity for more lawsuits because, dollars for lawyers. But there are real problems online. And we've heard a lot of people say, well, look, there's drugs, there's bad actions, all this stuff. If this happened in a newspaper or something or on a TV station, they're liable. Why is it okay for you to get this special protection for tech, as it's often been called? Rachel, you want to take a stab at that one?
Yeah. So I've been thinking a lot with these three guys. Recently been hearing about anti-vaccinators, right? Anti-vax. Is that the correct term? And what platforms have been doing to make sure that conspiracy theories around anti-vaccination don't spread and don't, spiral out of control, or there just isn't too much misinformation. And I think a company that we work with and that has looked at, there is bad content online. There are bad things that people say online. There are bad things people do online, and how do you curate that content? So Pinterest has been very proactive in working with, if anybody's been on Pinterest, you've probably seen, you might not have seen, but they're Finspiration. So, dieting tips and tricks on Pinterest. And obviously, that's a big portion of what people use Pinterest for, healthy habits, and that's great. But they started seeing a lot of really pro-anorexia, pro-bulimia content, and thought to themselves, we don't want that type of content. So how do you moderate and figure out where the line is? And so Pinterest actually worked closely with doctors, with survivors groups, with moms and daughters and psychologists, and figured out, how do we draw that line, and how do we moderate the content? They're doing the same thing right now with the anti-vaccine debate, and that you can post anti-vaccine content, but it won't be repinned anywhere, and it won't be linked and shared further than you can still say it, but they're not letting it, create this big echo chamber. And so I think that we need laws like Section 230, because we're never going to be able to stop people from having conspiracy theories are as old as humanity itself. We're not going to stop conspiracy theories, but there are ways that tech companies can work with their users and concerned citizens and people who want to enjoy their platform to make sure that people are seeing the things they do want to see, and make sure that we're not spreading conspiracy theories or criminal activity or antisocial behavior further than we can. And it's hard. None of these companies are getting it right. It's not perfect yet. I don't know if it will ever be perfect, because people are imperfect, but it's like too far of a psychological debate for us to have. But the point is that Section 230, with their provisions, can allow companies to think creatively about what types of content and how they want to moderate that content.
So at the risk of being glib, one way that I sort of like to think about this is that no matter how much you yell at the paperboy, it's not going to change the news, or it's not going to turn the paperboy into a good fact checker. And the reason for that is that the paperboy is sitting quite far on the information supply chain from the creation and sourcing and fact checking of content. And you can find the paperboy $50 million, but it will not make him a better fact checker. That's just like a structural truth of the information ecosystem. Now, I think there's understandable ire that people have when the paperboy makes 60 cents on the ad dollar, or the paperboy is now bigger than the newspaper, and that there's a distortion there that people are perceiving. So I think the concept that is a giveaway to tech companies, to me, sort of doesn't get at the structural nature of how information gets delivered, which is that tech companies in this context are those of us who provide tools for everyone to post things and write things. And we're standing in the shoes, for me, of the 90 million folks who read on Medium and the 7 million who write. So I think of it as like, this is a group of people that has consented to saying, like, we want you to stand up for us to be able to write what we want. And so, and this is the law that lets us get out of the way. And mind you, all the things that we've said so far, I think back in the old world, you could just sue somebody for writing a bad thing. This is still true. You can still sue a person for writing a bad thing about you online. The thing that this law really helps do is make us not be the weak link in the chain and be a soft touch, where an enterprising lawyer will say, it's very useful to go to the paperboy, because then the news is not going to make it to your house. And what CDA 230 allows us to do is to have a backbone and say, if you don't like what somebody wrote, it's absolutely appropriate to go and say this person wrote lies about me, as it's always been. But if you allow us to become a weak link in the chain, as we would be if CDA 230 went away, then you're creating a very fundamental weakness in this information ecosystem that I think characterizing it as a giveaway to tech companies really doesn't understand the magnitude of that risk.
And I think speaking to what Alex said earlier about, it would be an $800,000 suit if we even had to go to discovery, and Patreon is in a similar position where we couldn't survive too many of those. And it does make us into a weak link if that had to be the next step, because from a structural standpoint, as a company, we're going to prioritize being in business over defending, all the speech on our platform. And so if the choices exist as a platform and have a little bit less free speech or don't exist, we're going to choose to exist. And so it's also just a structural way of allowing us to do that.
And I think there's a tendency to look at this, for people to think about this in terms of analogies that I think sometimes get a little too simplistic. It's not a case of newspapers operate like this offline and online platforms operate like this online. I mean, newspapers still exist online, and they take responsibility for the things that people who write under the byline write. What a lot of platforms are doing is something fundamentally different from what happened pre-internet, and which is why the analogy sort of breaks down a little bit. Wikipedia is not like the Encyclopedia Britannica in the way that it's built, in the way that it's structured, in the way that it comes together, and how it operates. Sure, a lot of the form of content will be similar. Yeah, we want to be an encyclopedia, just the way that they have been. But the way in which it operates is fundamentally different, and it isn't quite that same analogy. So it's not a case of this is special because it's online. It's because the rules simply didn't exist for collections of people, not self-organized outside of that space.
And we're going to open up for questions in a minute as I start percolating. I do think it's important to note the kind of big issue in the room, which was passage of Sesta Fosta over the past year, which was a direct attack on Section 230. It began what I call the Swiss cheesing of Section 230. I mean, have we seen any unintended consequences come out of that? Because it was positioned as the cure for sex trafficking online. Have we seen that? Do you know? Have you guys seen any impact on that?
I can talk a little bit about, we've seen Craigslist has shut down their personal ad section. I think there are a lot of platforms that are much more conservative now about removing anything that could be, theoretically, that could be sex trafficking, but also just could be somewhat scandalous. And so there's a tendency now to over-remove or maybe not even to look at new business models or types of, particularly personal ads, dating platforms, or we might not have seen that. It's really too early to tell. There's only really been one case related to the law, and people are trying to figure out what they're going to do next.
I would sort of put it like this: like if you're doing our job for a second, and you're like, okay, now there's a law. I'm protected on all these things that folks post that we haven't touched, but then I know that anything that's related to trafficking, that is not true. I'm exposed for that. So then it's like you're looking at pictures of, here's a picture of my beach vacation. Here's a picture of me and my partner. Here's a picture of our weird private diary. You have to look at that and be like, was this person trafficked? How do I know? What facts can I get access to as a person who's just working online to allow me to understand how to do this risk analysis properly? Because any naked picture of a person posted on the internet by themselves is now a thing where you have to do an analysis that's incredibly fact-intensive about how related is this to things that nobody wants, like human trafficking. But as a platform, you now have one small carve-out that says, like, okay, this is an area where all sorts of facts that you can't possibly know are the things that determine how responsible you are. And so from that perspective, I just sort of ask you, like, if you just think of it as like a structure management problem, it really becomes very challenging, because you sort of say, like, all I have is the face of this content, whatever I can Google. How can I possibly ever do something like this related to trafficking? And this is sort of, I think, would be true for lots of different things that one might be tempted to pass as carbon. which cause people operating platforms to have to know things out there in the world that is virtually impossible to thoroughly know.
Yeah, I was talking to some staffers about opioids, right? And they were saying, well, why don't you just take down anything related to opioids? I said, well, it's an interesting idea, but what if I'm a parent looking for a substance abuse clinic for opioids? If I just auto-delete, or any time the word opioids is related, they can't find my help. And so it's not just there's no silver bullet to the solution. It's really a scalpel type solution where I think, trying to do it through Section 230 is a brute force, which will have unintended consequences. Colin, sorry, I cut you off.
Oh, I mean, I was just going to agree with Alex that, and again, framing within the concept of running a business and legal as a cost center, and you're trying to understand, like, where can you actually operate within the margins of your business, and if there's some small segment of your users that is causing an outsized portion of liability that you have to deal with, the natural reaction as a business is to purge those users. And that's generally not a good outcome for anybody, but it's the outcome that the company's sort of forced into unless they're able to somehow find a creative solution, which is not always easy. And also on that point of opioids, I mean, we have creators on Patreon who talk about their battles with addiction. And that's just one situation where often there'll be lots of drug keywords and they come up when we do searches for drugs. And that's content that we want to have on the platform because it's sort of a societal good. It's somebody talking about their battles with addiction, trying to overcome it, often trying to help others who are going through a similar situation. But that's a situation where if there's any doubt around whether we could have that content, then it would be a difficult decision, but ultimately we'd have to run a profitable business.
So go ahead.
I agree and stipulate that FOSTA-SESTA has had a very negative effect on sex workers, free speech, and unquestionably, in my mind, a very negative development. On the other hand, there is a tremendous amount of pressure up here to regulate platforms. What I'm hearing from you, and this is what you've been addressing in the last couple of minutes, is that there really is no modification to Section 230, the notice of takedown portions or anything else, no modifications at all to Section 230 that really can be acceptable within the free speech framework that you're talking about. Is that right? It's got to be all or nothing?
No, I actually, Daphne Keller, who's at Stanford, she recently published a paper in the Hoover Institute about ways you could amend Section 230 or modify it. I think, and Sherwin has this wonderful book about their transparency reports, but I think a lot of the conversation here, particularly around anti-conservative bias, is my speech was taken down. These liberals out in San Francisco hate us. I'm a Republican, so I'm allowed to.
It's okay.
Yeah.
Safe space.
But a lot of times it feels like we're trying to regulate by anecdote. That it's like my thing got taken down and I don't know why. So I think one thing that we could do is require more transparency, require platforms to have more transparency, and require more of a notice. Not all platforms tell you when your speech or your post has been taken down. And if so, there could be some regulation about awareness, making it easier for users to see how and why posts were removed, and then also creating a mechanism for government to understand more of the data of what was removed and why, and what was moderated and why. I think would be one solution.
I would say also quickly, because you said there's a desire to regulate, which I understand. I think, to me, the question is then, what specific thing do you want to accomplish with a particular law? So if your question is, I want elections to have integrity, and I want to understand who is paying for which ads are shown to me related to a political campaign, to me, that's an election law issue, and it should regulate platforms. So to me, the idea of social media law or platform law is sort of like a law of the horse question. Each of the individual problems that one would want to solve, I think, can and should be regulated. And they may wind up having to interact with CD 230 in complicated ways, and I sort of accept that. But I think the idea that we've been talking really implicitly about defamation liability this whole time, and I think that's framed up the conversation. But I think the question of like, what is the thing that you want to accomplish, and is it accomplishable through some subject-specific law that accomplishes that end, is a totally reasonable way to go about it.
Oh, and I think a lot of the discussion, there's been litigation and discussion in the past as well, focuses on, and one of the key questions is, 230 isn't a get out of jail free card, right? It simply says, this user was not speaking for everybody. So if the platform actually violates election law or speaks as itself as a thing, they are still liable. And so it's merely that, drawing that distinction and that separation. And people try and, I think there have been bad actors who try and play at the margins and try and say, oh, I wanted to get out of jail free card. And usually that doesn't work too well. At the same time, you want to make sure that, that the platform is what it is and it's not sort of conflating these motivations.
One last point I'll make is, again, sort of on the issue of conflating. Oftentimes, when people say they want to moderate or regulate platforms, what they mean is they don't like what Facebook or Twitter or some of the larger tech companies are doing. And remember that there's thousands of other tech companies which are incredibly smaller in scale, and that if you pass an overly broad regulation, it actually keeps that smaller tech company segment down and makes it harder for them to compete with the larger tech companies, and really just cements the power of the larger tech companies at the end of the day.
In the middle of white, sure. Yes. Yes.
Hi, my name is Andreas. I work in the Office of Commerce and Bill of Practice. I think in principle, Section 230 is actually a pretty good thing. I have actually started with a few tech companies myself before I came here. Okay, and it actually did help us a lot. So what we were doing. But there's an implicit assumption with the morality of this law that the tech companies that are given this responsibility are going to be good actors and actually promote free speech on their platforms. However, there's a real substantiated history of bad actors that have deplatformed people recently, even for activities outside the platform, including your organization, Patreon, that deplatformed Carl Benjamin for the statements he made outside the platform that were not in violation of their terms of service. So I want to know how you can sit here and tell us that you're a good actor that I should trust after we have clear evidence that you violated your own terms of service and infected the ethos of this law.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for that question. I really appreciate that. As a starting point, I would say, broadly, the purpose of all of our community guidelines is to maximize the number of creators that can use Patreon. So under that sort of goal, we find the areas where there are sections that would decrease motivation for creators to join. So hate speech is one of those areas where we made some value judgments. Admittedly, they're value judgments, but we chose that certain parts of hate speech we thought would hurt the ability for our platform to survive as a business. And in Carl Benjamin's case, he actually did violate our guidelines. I know that there's this meme going around that because it was not said on the Patreon platform that it wasn't a violation, but actually our guidelines are that if you fund the content through our guidelines or through our platform, then it's in a violation of our guidelines. So if you're not familiar with Carl Benjamin, he's actually one of the most prolific collaborators in this sort of, I think there's a phrase that some intellectual uses, like the intellectual dark web or something. But anyway, he's one of the most prolific collaborators within that space. And most of his work is actually done as interviews or collaborations with other people. And so in this case, it was an interview that he was doing on another creator's channel. And his output of work is what is being funded through Patreon. And so even if it wasn't him doing it on his own show on Patreon, because he was doing it as an interview on another show and was part of his overall creative work, that was being funded through Patreon. And so as a result, the things that he said, which if anybody's not familiar, he went on a rant where he used some racial and homophobic slurs in that rant, and that's against our guidelines. And so as a result, you're removed from the platform.
Who's using those slurs to speak against racism and homophobia? It's obvious in video.
Well, I would characterize it differently, but we can agree to disagree on that.
And regardless, the nice thing about Section 230 is if he decides tomorrow that he wants to build his own website, create his own funding system, he can do that. And look, I like Rachel, I'm a conservative, I speak about this a lot. We had a panel on this exact issue back in November. As a conservative, my opinion is we should keep freedom as broadly defined as possible. Right now, we're here on Section 230. Amending it curtails freedoms, and whether people put up speech that we like, great. Whether people put up speech we don't like, also great. Not my favorite, but still. I think it's up to every platform to decide what's appropriate for their users at the end of the day. As a conservative, I believe in free markets and limited government. So more freedom, the better. Sir?
So you were talking about the difference between like a platform and institutions, like actively promoting things, right? So to take the analogy of the paperboy, there's some companies that sort of straddle the line, right? Maybe they're delivering the news, but they pull one page from the back, put it on the front, and circle it with a big highlighter because it'll make them more money. This is a bigger issue with large platforms, but like it's hard to sort of define what behavior counts as editorializing and what's just with Reddit. Like, is something getting upvoted, voted, then featuring it? Then how do you draw that line in a regulatory way where you're addressing that issue and those potentially perverse incidents without trampling on the overall thing?
Yeah, I think that's like a super precise way of framing it. I appreciate it. I should say, by the way, I actually was a paperboy as a kid. And one of the things that I did was assemble papers. So I actually exerted very limited editorial choice in that I didn't have much discretion, but I assembled 14 sections of the New York Times into one coherent New York Times that I then delivered. And so, to reinforce your point, like the amount of sort of like the amplification effects, or the fact that one's like home feed or email or whatever is a combination of human curation and algorithmic programmatic things, and that the entire environment you experience in a website is constructed based on your preferences. Like, I think that's totally legitimate. That like there's a set of selection and curation and amplification that occurs that we have to take account of. I think Section 230 may be the wrong way to do it, and that the line around are you materially contributing to the content or not is a very good, clean, bright line of figuring out what you're doing. I think issues around whether the liability that we're talking about, like defamation, is that it feels to me that curation and these other selection processes must be accounted for in things like transparency around algorithms, letting people know how it is that you're coming to see the things that you are seeing. I think that's like a pressure point that I totally agree with the legitimacy of. I think CD 230 is sort of the wrong place to exert pressure on causing there to be more transparency around sort of algorithms and curation. But I welcome other views in this, but that's where I'm on this right now.
Yeah, I mean, basically what you suggested is a law review paper, because it is a really interesting question. At the end of the day, we do want prioritized information. When I do a search for, I took my son to see Lego Movie 2 this weekend, right? It told me where the theater that I usually go to, what the times were, what the prices were. That was prioritization. It didn't just give me a blast of every movie theater around the country. So we want customized feeds because there's so much information out there. There's no way to go through it all. But to your point, you do have a good question about how do we know that this is being adjusted. There is a good amount of case law out of the Ninth Circuit. Eric Goldman out of UC Santa Clara, thank you, is a real expert on this. But to the point where it's not a bright line, but the closer you edge to that line of being just a platform to content creator, as soon as you hit the tipping point, then you are fully liable.
And I think when it comes to questions of curation, that this is where you start to see that balance between these two parts of the Good Samaritan rule, right? One of them is you're not the speaker. The other part is you can moderate content. You're not liable for taking steps to take down things, right? So, for example, if somebody's posting non-encyclopedic content on Wikipedia, it's not a question of are we a town square for free speech. It's like, no, we want this to be an encyclopedia. If you're just, if you're posting personal essays, no, moderators can take that down, and there shouldn't be any liability attaching to that. Is that exercising editorial judgment? Well, I mean, the moderators are exercising their judgment, but it's not necessarily rising to the level of speech, and so that tension certainly exists as well.
Yeah, real quick, when it comes to the urgency, this briefing, the website ends at 2008 on its timeline of section 230. And I was just wondering, like, if you mentioned in the invite for this, like the overall atmosphere of legislation being proposed, like, is there a CRA or legislation that you are concerned about or would support? And then two, we just experienced net neutrality getting struck down by the FCC completely without Congress being involved at all. Is that at all in the periphery of this issue?
So just to move the second part of the question off the scale, that is a wholly different issue on net neutrality. I think conflating the two is just going to confuse us all. But to your first point on Section 230, I mean, we are hearing the ruminations, the concerns. What you're seeing is that there are efforts by groups that have lost eyeballs and influence to new outlets, new upstarts, everything, and they're threatened. They're threatened, and they're lashing out, and they're sometimes taking advantage of really bad situations. Like one of my greatest concerns with SESTA FOSTA, because I worked a lot on that issue, I met with the victims groups, is that we pass a law and now we just move on, but it hasn't really been effective. So we're hearing concerns about opioid trafficking. What I want to see is a collaborative process where we all get together and really try to address the underlying situation, get more information out to people, maybe getting businesses to collaborate when they see certain IP addresses or email addresses, certain bad actors, certain flags. That's my concern, is that you're seeing a really bad situation being manipulated to attack.
I think one area that is on the table right now that Congress is considering that deals with Section 230 is the new NAFTA agreement with the United States, Mexico, Canada agreement. I think one thing that we all kind of skipped over is that Section 230 is something that the U.S. came up with 20 years ago, and there's a reason our tech sector is the envy of the world. We have these great laws in place, and many other countries, including Canada and Mexico, although I think some of us might agree with Canada's law a little bit more, but anyway, the point is, our tech sector has benefited tremendously from having this freedom and ability to create platforms and moderate that content. And so our own intermediary liability laws are part of the new USMCA agreement. And, Engine is part of a really broad coalition that I think was announced just this morning of over 200 different organizations who support the passage of USMCA, and we hope that we can continue to export Section 230. Europe is doing a really terrible job of carving out new different burdens on platforms, whether that's copyright or terrorist content. But we as Americans and in Washington should be proud of our tech sector and what we've managed to accomplish. And I hope that, one of the reasons we support USMCA, but I hope that we continue to use Section 230 as the gold standard to export to other countries who have intermediate liability laws.
One of the things that we're seeing is that people are increasingly concerned. People are highlighting problematic things that are happening online and harmful things that are being done and said online. And I think people who are less familiar with sort of how Section 230 works might look at that and say, oh, this is allowing this to happen, when a lot of times the underlying harmful content may not actually be illegal. And so the question is, how do we cut back on certain types of behavior? How do we work to fix these things without passing laws that would run afoul of the First Amendment? Meanwhile, Section 230 sort of sits off to the side, not actually directly relevant to that particular conversation, but it looks like it could be, and that is it's attempting like red herring.
Any other final questions? So I'll turn it over to our panelists. So you're going to get on, head back to work, basically, get back to making a cool system. Just, can you picture where you would be right now, circling back to the beginning? This is a foundational law. Where would we be without Section 230? Where would your platforms be? Like, what is this dystopian reality that we would have otherwise left into? And I'll just go down the line. So, Alex, you better come with an idea quickly.
Yeah, so I think we would probably have a lot less stuff, and we would largely have puppies and rainbows and other non-controversial content. But in any case, the things that we would have to, as Colin said, be wise in our business judgment and skew heavily towards things that are non-controversial and popular and don't cause other people to hold us responsible. So, it would, in short, it'd be a wholly different platform. I'm not sure there's any way we could avoid that.
I mean, the default before was that there's either no moderation or you prevented all possible bad actors. For us, that actually wouldn't be a possibility because we also do payments, so we actually couldn't go to the default. So the only way that we could exist would be if we moderated anything that was potentially liable. So yeah, it would be a much more boring platform.
Well, I just got on my America's the greatest country on earth soapbox, so
I support it.
I'll stop there. Section 230 is obviously really important.
I'm not sure that Wikipedia could exist, certainly not in its current form. It would either have to be a lot smaller or a lot more centrally controlled, and neither of those things sort of is a part of what it is. So if, sure, somebody could come up with a nonprofit and give it the same name. It would not work. Certainly not the way it does today.
Yeah, and there are really complex questions and really tough situations, and I think the easy go-to is like, oh, look at this law that some people may not know about, or this Section 230, whatever. Let's go fix it because it's on the internet. But to your point, it's the weak link, right? You're not addressing the bad actor who gets kicked off the platform. You're not addressing really the needs of the victim. All you're doing is breaking the chain, and at the end, all these businesses and all these small startups just can't operate. And that's kind of the message we want to leave you with today. Is it's more than just the big guys out there. It's any website. It's my mom building a website on Weebly so she can sell her jewelry. I mean, it's my aunt and uncle in South Bend, Indiana, with their dentist website. That's what Section 230 allows. And it allows them to take comments and feedback. And so that's really what I get worried about, is the loss of those types of protections.
Can I say one quick thing, which is that for folks who want the experience, I would try running a Facebook group and moderating it. Get the experience and see what it feels like, because I think you'll learn a lot that way about what you want to take on and what you don't want to.
Thank you very much. If you could give my panelists